Well, good rainy Monday morning, and welcome to the Mowat Center's Symposium on Emerging Energy Trends. My name is Sean Conway. I am a visiting fellow at Ryerson University and a policy advisor at Gowling WLG. Delighted to see a lot of familiar faces here. My job description for the day is kind of a male version of Vanna White, is just to kind of keep this thing running. We are now 3 minutes late. We are going to have a hard stop at 4 o'clock. We've got some excellent panels, and we want to give those panels and give you, the audience, every opportunity to derive as much as possible from this very timely session today. Just a couple of housekeeping details. You'll see on your desks paper. And Paul Somerville, who will be here momentarily to bring the perspective of the conference organizers, Paul has made it very clear, and I think rightly so, that we want this to be as interactive as possible. So each panel is to run about an hour and 15 minutes. There will be an opportunity, hopefully a good opportunity, for people to ask questions or make comments. What we are going to do, there are some bright young people here who will be traveling around to pick up questions or comments, which will then come up to me so that we get a chance to, and you can ask questions either in literal form or orally from the floor, but just so you know that that's what those papers are, and they're intended, we want you to make full use of those. We also want, let me just say at the outset, this conference would not be happening without the very generous support of the following sponsors: Enbridge, Hydro Ottawa, Electra Utilities, and IESO. So to all of you people, we thank you very, very much for offering very strong and generous support for this session today. Not surprisingly, technology is having a great impact on all of us, and nowhere more so than in the energy sector. I don't know whether any of you had a chance to look at this morning's New York Times. There's a great story on the front page of, I think it's called Cornell Tech, and the new engineering building at Cornell University, which is about to be officially inaugurated in the heart of Manhattan, and which looks like it's going to be very close to a net zero building. Fascinating story about, in this case, a university that is building a new physical space in the heart of Manhattan in ways that would have been 10, 20 years ago almost inconceivable. And I just, as I read that this morning, I thought to myself, yet more evidence of what we all know, namely that energy is a critical part of the way in which we live our lives, not just at home, but at work or at school. And there is a great deal happening that is having a major effect on the way in which we live those lives. So that's what today's conference is about. We've got, as I said earlier, 4 very excellent panels. And to give a little bit of greater context, it's my singular pleasure to invite someone I have known for a very long time, looking very Squire-like, Paul Somerville, the Executive Director of Mowat Energy. Paul?
Thanks, Sean. Thank you, Sean. Really appreciate your support for the conference today. First, a heartfelt welcome to each and every one of you. When you first decide to convene a conference of this nature, you really have no idea as to what you're getting yourself into. And while the task is challenging, let me say that it has been made immeasurably easier by the extraordinary generosity of people and organizations who have agreed to lend their expertise and effort to the important discussion that we hope to have today. First, I'd like to echo Sean's note of gratitude to the sponsors of this conference, without whose generous assistance it could not have happened. I'm speaking of Enbridge, IESO, Ottawa Hydro, and Electra Utilities. We are deeply grateful for their support. And next, I'd like to acknowledge the moderators and panelists, each of whom has made a significant commitment to today's program. Without their engagement, none of this would have been possible. And I think that you will agree that we have assembled a very strong roster of experts and advocates. I'm very pleased to tell you that our invitations for their participation were accepted almost without exception instantly. I want to thank each and every one of them. And I want to thank each and every one of you for coming today. Our goal today is to provide a respectful and organized forum for the exchange of ideas. Here in Ontario, we are confronting what may emerge as revolutionary change in the way our energy markets operate. As I think everyone in this room knows, all over the world, policymakers, regulators, and customers are seeing changes in how energy is delivered and organized in their respective jurisdictions. Technological innovation and new ways for customers to configure their relationship to their energy suppliers has the potential to fundamentally alter the policy and regulatory environment. It also has profound implications for the economy of the province. Simply put, the emerging distributed energy resource environment is likely to create substantially decentralized energy system. This development and the pace at which it arrives needs careful policy and regulatory analysis. Many of the people here are directly engaged in trying to create optimal conditions for the accommodation of distributed energy resources. Today, we will hear about pilot programs that have been designed to explore these opportunities and challenges. We will also hear about the experience of other jurisdictions who are struggling, just as we are, to find constructive solutions to the challenges posed. These are important insights. The decentralization of the energy system in Ontario raises these fundamental issues about our existing architecture. Structural elements such as the monopoly distribution franchise and the application of traditional rate-making techniques may be challenged, and challenged in very fundamental ways. We note that the new direction, confidently described in the early days of New York's REV program, has given way to the more difficult task of trying to realize and operationalize that vision. We've also seen very recently that California is exploring through consultation issues related to exit fees and legacy obligations. We know that it is seductive for experts and advocates to sometimes foresee a kind of utopian future where all of the difficulties are resolved through the application of rational solutions. We know that it is seductive to try to pick winners and sometimes to embrace technological advances without necessarily considering all of the complexity of the very diverse and dynamic environment in which they operate. The road to hell is paved with unintended consequences. We can take a small measure of comfort, if that is the right word, in the fact that others are struggling to arrive at the right policy and regulatory environment within their jurisdictions. It is not an easy task for them, and it's not an easy task for us. Our purpose today is to do no more than provide an opportunity for the expression of the conflicting values and ideas that may emerge in this new environment. We expect that there will be some material disagreements about how this evolution ought to be managed, or indeed whether it should be managed at all. We will have succeeded in our task today if the discussion surfaces some of these conflicts and assists, even in a small way, in the development of confident and responsible policy and regulation. At Mowat, we are not advocates for any particular response or outcome. What we are hoping to do is simply provide an opportunity for the best possible evidence to surface in the public forum. That is our goal. Success or failure lies largely within your hands. We have tried to create a format that favors the exchange of views through discussion and debate. And we have made provision within the timeframes governing us for you to engage in this discussion, as Sean has outlined. We urge you to take full advantage of this opportunity to challenge views with which you disagree and raise questions that you think are being overlooked. We know that the subject matter is much larger than this conference can accommodate, but we hope that providing this forum, we will advance the discussion responsibly. I'd like to turn the proceedings back to Sean, and we will begin with our first panel dealing with the question of regional planning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think that took 7 or 8 minutes, and I can't recall a speech where in 7 minutes I heard someone use the words seduction, utopian, road to hell. Very good, Paul. That was a wake-up call that we probably all required. Our first of 4 panels is, for my money, one of the most interesting and relevant, and that is regional energy planning. And to moderate that panel, someone that you will know, I'm sure, if you've been around for more than a day or two in this sector, is George Vegh from McCarthy Tétrault. George, come forward with your panel. George, by the way, as you see in your program, all the bios are listed there, but George has been around this debate, I won't say how long, but it's been a very long time, and we're very, very fortunate to have him here today. So, George, to you and your panel, the first debate, regional energy planning. Your way here.
Thank you for that introduction, Sean, and thanks for making me sound so old when you set it up. I'd like to thank Mowat Energy both for inviting me to participate in this conference, which looks like a really interesting set of discussions, and for contributing more generally to the ideas in our sector by publishing materials and putting on discussion forums like this. I think it makes a huge contribution. So I think the job that Paul and Richard and others do is very important, and I appreciate being a part of it. So our panel is going to talk about regional planning, and we're discussing this, of course, in the context of energy trends, and the conference starts with a panel discussion on planning and ends with a discussion on policy, and I think that those are good bookends because everything in this province ultimately ends up in policy. While planning starts by looking at rather technical issues of supply-demand and how different resources can meet those needs, it's ultimately not just solving a technical problem, but it's in a policy context. Because in Ontario, of course, all resource decisions are made by the government, whether it's procurements for supply or conservation or now transmission. Everything in Ontario starts and ends with the government. And so when we look at resources and how they should be acquired and the way in which they're acquired and how they should be working together, you end up in a policy discussion, but planning tries to put a layer of rationality and facts within to be taken into account by those policy decisions. And the effectiveness of planning to be able to do that is something that I'll be listening for and looking forward to investigating with the panel that we have today. So how this discussion is going to work, as Paul mentioned, we are looking for contributions and discussions from the floor. So each of the speakers will make a short description of who they are and what they're doing and what their engagement is in the planning process, and then we'll have a discussion among all of them. So how we're going to, the order in which we're going to proceed is, I'll give a brief introduction as I mentioned, these people, but their biographies are in the program, so please feel free to read them. We're going to start with Joe Toneguzzo. He's at the IESO, Director of Transmission Integration, and he's in the PSP group, the Power System Planning Group, and Joe's going to talk about system planning. Following Joe, we'll have Fernando Carou from the City of Toronto, where he leads a community energy planning program. We'll then hear from Richard Laszlo of Quest, and I think everyone here knows about Quest. And we'll go to, after Richard, we'll hear from Sarah Vanderpelt at Union Gas, and then Scott Stevens from Northland Power. So thank you very much, and we'll hand it over to Joe to lead us off.
Do these work? Can everybody hear me okay? All right, so I'll just talk from here. So I was going to start off with a bit of context, basically to talk about regional planning at the high level, how it is undertaken in the province. So in general, it's very simply a systematic process for ensuring that the electricity needs of customers in a specific regional area are met. Sounds like a pretty simple, sounds like a pretty simple undertaking, but it's very complicated overall in the province. It looks at factors like growth, so the capacity of the power system to meet growth in electrical demand. It looks at, within a given regional area, it looks at service quality issues. And by that I mean things like reliability performance, making sure you can continue to supply your customers at the appropriate voltage levels, factors such as that. So it looks at growth, service quality, and an emerging issue that needs to be considered in regional planning, we're finding, is it also looks at what to do when the infrastructure in the area reaches end of life. So we've got a system in the province that both at the generation and the transmission and distribution level requires a significant amount of replacement as a result of end of life. And regional planning needs to be, or that particular issue needs to be factored into planning while we're doing it. The result of regional planning is a plan, basically. It's a plan for a local area, and it identifies the investments that are required by the power system or perhaps by customers through incremental conservation programs, through programs like demand response that are cost-effective for all ratepayers in the province. The process is required to be performed by the Ontario Energy Board, and it involves all the players involved, included in planning, the local distribution companies, transmitters in the province, and the independent electricity system operator. Now, the IESO brings a number of factors to this planning exercise. It's aware of, for example, resource contracts, new ones that may be coming forward, old ones that may be expiring, and all that's important when planning for the electricity supply in the area. The IESO is also familiar with bulk system needs in the area. So the bulk system and the regional supply system in this province are very closely integrated. That isn't the same, I would say, for most utilities in the world. Ontario has a unique connection arrangement in the way it connects regional areas to the bulk system. And as a result, there's a great potential for synergies between bulk system planning and regional planning that needs to be captured in this process. The IESO is also familiar with or has all the details of the power system characteristics, of course. You need to get into a lot of detailed studies. And also, the IESO has become aware of typical costs for non-wire solutions. So that's what the IESO brings to the table in terms of this planning process. Transmitters, well, what they bring to the table is the feasibility of technically viable alternatives, wires alternatives, high voltage wires alternatives, in fact. They also are good at providing us estimates of costs that need to be compared through the regional planning process. And they also own the equipment, so they understand the equipment's capability and the service quality needs of customers. So if there are power quality problems in the area, they're aware of that, and that needs to be factored into our analysis in some cases. And in a similar way, the distribution companies also are familiar with the technical feasibility of distribution solutions. Many times, the problem to growth in an area could be through solving it through low voltage wires, and we have seen that in many cases. Costs as well for those low voltage facilities, and they have the links to the customers and the links to the communities typically in the area. So they understand where the growth pockets are, they understand what the customer issues are, and in some cases, they may understand what some preferred solutions of customers are. And they may even be providers of solutions for non-wires options. They are responsible, of course, for demand management in the area as well, which is a big part of that process. So I mentioned that it's required by the regulator, that it involves those parties, and the plans that get produced from a regulatory perspective form the basis for investments that are expected in rate cases. And these investments may be investments related to incremental conservation, the incorporation of distributed energy resources, or, of course, wire solutions. The process, by its nature, given that customers are an active part, really, now of the power system. There are technical solutions that customers are implementing either to manage their electricity costs, to hit other environmental targets they want to hit. But there are solutions that definitely customers have a big part to play in. So engaging with customers and engaging with communities is very important. So not only is it customers that are becoming active in electricity planning, communities, municipalities, indigenous communities, small towns are all beginning to become active in energy planning through the development of community energy plans, which have been promoted by the provincial government. These plans, in some cases, can help solve power system problems. In other cases, may result in conversion to electricity and result in more use of electricity. So both from a solution perspective and from a needs perspective, these plans need to be considered in the development of solutions and in the development of plans. In terms of where we're at, current status of regional planning. One cycle of the process has been complete. We have plans for every regional area that had growth or needs in place in the province. Most of the solutions that came forward were wire solutions. At this point in time, there was a bit of catch-up to do. This is the first time we've gone through the province. And what we found is there was a significant challenge in putting in place, especially where there was some pent-up demand, solutions that were non-wires based. So if you look at the plans that are on the websites of the IESO or the transmitters in the province, or links from LDC plans, what you'll find is many of the solutions are wires-based at this point in time, but many did recommend in the midterm looking at non-wire solutions and more aggressive conservation programs or the redirecting of conservation programs into areas of need. Last point I want to make is, having gone through the cycle once, there has been a lot of areas that we found that need improvement. One is end-of-life planning. With respect to end-of-life planning, what we found the first time through is transmitters and distributors typically only had plans in place that looked out about 2 or 3 years, consistent with the rate cases they were developing. What we believe, at least as IESO, is that we need to look out at least 10 years and anticipate at least a decade in advance what assets need to be replaced so that can be properly factored into planning. We also need better coordination with community energy plans. First time through the province, many of these plans were just getting off the ground, or many of the teams related to community energy planning were just getting formed. Next time through, what we expect is that these plans will be much more evolved and we'll be able to factor them in, which will require a significant amount of engagement in order to get at all that information. And last point, in terms of an improvement area, we need to better understand how to implement non-wire solutions. We need to understand and reach agreement on how to incorporate local avoided costs, how to integrate those local avoided costs with system-level costs, and how to reconcile the fact that while we may need capacity in a local area, the power system in general may not need energy. So especially when you get into incorporating distributed energy resources, we're going to need to think hard about the economics of how do you value the local capacity, but then how do you treat the fact that this thing also produces energy and the province has plenty of it for now. So those are my remarks. I think we're in good shape. We've got people in place in the planning entities that understand the process very well at this point in time. We've worked closely with the Ontario Energy Board to make sure the process is working well. There's a standing committee that does that. And I think we're in good shape moving forward in terms of evolving the process for the next cycle. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And I think the comments you ended with, where things may be improved, could provide good fodder for discussion. So thank you for laying that out. So our next speaker is Fernando Carou of the City of Toronto, and as I mentioned, he leads a community energy planning program. So Fernando, why don't we hear from you?
Sure, thank you. So good morning. Thanks for having me again. I remember about 4 years ago, actually it was the fall of 2013. Had quite a bit more hair back then, or maybe a little more. And we were talking actually about these similar issues in the eve actually of the release of the long-term energy plan. And actually folks here at MOWA were nice enough to actually film it and so on. So I won't repeat myself, and I can share that link to you all. But what I remember, from that discussion was, sort of what are the mega trends, that are going to be affecting energy, right? Because, in this room, I guess it's safe to say that we're all energy geeks, right? So, we think that energy is the dog, but in fact, actually, it's the tail, right? When it comes to actually to the big projects, right? It's all about, shared prosperity, the economy, well-being, right? And energy actually has to, it's a very important input, but as an input, right? It's actually smaller in any metric, in any magnitude that you can think of in terms of, the other, big projects that we're into. So I just wanted to mention that. Actually, another interesting thing is, when I talk to my colleagues in Calgary, when they say energy, they mean oil and gas, right? But here in Ontario, when we say energy, we mean electricity. So it's an interesting, so what do we mean by energy, right? So quickly, in terms of the major trends, the mega trends that we're seeing, clearly, the economy has changed in the last 10 years. I remember, because I was in automotive, in 2008 with the financial crisis, and I can tell you, how many plants we closed, right? So the economy has changed. We have a lot less manufacturing, more service activity. And also, on average, actually, we've decoupled economic and population growth from energy and water use, right? At the same time, actually, those post-industrial or even before manufacturing, but portlands and waterfronts, all those brownfields actually are in the process of being redeveloped. So it poses a challenge in terms of how to service areas that were not well served by energy systems. And think of the railway lands here in downtown Toronto, with City Place creating a new community of 10,000 people, creating a new town in Toronto. So I think that's a major trend, the change in the economy that challenges actually the energy systems. I think the other one actually, which is the one that I created a little bit of, sort of this new profession of community energy planning, which is what the hell is community energy planning, right? But the bottom line actually is that in Ontario, right, we are growing in a much different way than we did over the last 50, 60 years, right? And it's not by accident. Actually, it was an act, by the provincial government of smart growth to essentially infill or grow the areas actually that we are already urbanized. And in fact, one of the major components of that actually was to have enough density, right, to make public transport and transportation a reality. You need to have actually that ridership, right? So if you look at what happened after that, all the municipalities in Ontario had to actually amend their official plans. The City of Toronto did. And you may be familiar with the City of Toronto official plan or not. Who's familiar with the official plan? Right? Okay, so I thought so. So that's a major, if you hear anything from me today, okay, the official plan is a major beacon actually of, where energy consumption, energy growth actually is in the city. So, folks that live in Toronto actually know that the official plan protects existing, I guess, communities, small residential communities, right? Think of inside, Main and Main. But it also actually has a purpose objective to actually deliver actually density around the centers, so the downtown being the major one, which is going to double in population in the next 20 years. And then you've got actually the avenues, right, which is really where growth is meant to actually aid or provide the ridership for transit, right? So these are like major mega trends. And why are these mega trends? Because the way we look at it actually, there's opportunities to actually co-locate. There's opportunities to actually bring energy into the mix, right? That's why I mean the tail and not the dog. So wherever you have a transit project, you should have an energy project, right? Because the transit, high-order transit will require electricity, right? And wherever we have actually a significant amount of development, like we have in Toronto, where you're creating actually a new town substantially, ostensibly, every few months with, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 10,000 people, by Lower Yonge in the waterfront, right? Clearly, there's an opportunity. If you're going to do a, $5 billion project, right? There's an opportunity to actually integrate energy into it, as opposed to leaving it, for later. And we're not talking about actually sort of being off the grid. I think it's an issue where you can have development, integrate energy solutions within it, transit projects, develop energy solutions within it, in a way actually that you can have the best of both worlds, right? Maybe the peakiness or the low carbon can be dealt at the community scale, and then you can have actually the systems, the natural gas distribution, electricity as the backbone. And in fact, you need that actually fundamentally because, look, because we're already urbanized in a lot of these locations that are going to take growth, there's no space. Like, I don't know about you actually, but I don't see a lot of space, left to do the old school, we'll put the infrastructure first and then the homes, right? So fundamentally, actually, the game has changed, right? And you don't need to believe me, right? But community planning, is real. It's not imaginary. It's essentially integrating energy into the mega trends that I've just told you about, right? And in fact, actually, is the opportunity to then try to do energy differently, which the system needs, by the way, because it's hard to actually reach into those urbanized areas in the way that we used to do it, before when we had the horizontal growth, right? With vertical growth, actually, it's very hard to go after the fact and do the transmission line or the power plant that takes 10 years in the making, in terms of environmental assessments and so on, right? So I think that's a very important point actually that gets missed, which is again, build energy actually into the big things that are going on, into a major waterfront revitalization like Toronto is doing and Mississauga is doing, right? Which is ironically it's the OPG lands in Mississauga, right? So it would be a shame not to include any energy where energy was, right? So that's one aspect actually. The other aspect actually is that, look, energy, by a show of hands, if I were to actually look at all the meters of natural gas and all the meters of electricity in Toronto and do a pie chart, who thinks it'll be 50-50 on an energy basis? Do you think energy actually, sort of electricity use and natural gas use is about 50-50? Is it more in favor actually of electricity or more in favor of natural gas? Just a quick show of hands. Anybody want to venture a guess? No? Okay, so you may be surprised actually, or not maybe, that natural gas actually is 75% approximately of the total energy. So I tricked you. I didn't say dollars, right? I said energy, right? Dollars actually is 5 to 1. Electricity 5 to 1 on natural gas. But on an energy basis, right? It's really thermal, because if you take actually the thermal portion of electricity for cooling, right? Then you're into actually almost the 80% territory, right? So what we're trying to do actually from the community planning point of view actually is that we're already also mapping low carbon sources of local energy, right? The more prominent being deep lake water cooling, right? The municipality actually made an investment and did 2 business cases that did not work by themselves. The water problem with the intake and the cooling, or the electricity crunch, right? Put them together actually, and we have 100+ buildings, maybe including this one, I'm not sure, that is actually cool, with deep lake water cooling, right? Avoiding 90% actually of electricity use, right? And I was just in Vancouver 2 weeks ago. I see Ron, he was in Vancouver as well for the renewable cities, and we toured actually the Southeast Falls Creek system, which actually recovers heat from sewage, and it actually powers or produces actually the thermal energy needed to condition space and heat water, for the entire Olympic Village. So the opportunities actually are, in my mind, actually to bring energy into the fold, into all the other things that are going on. And I think lastly, actually, is, because I'm getting the hook, is actually the fact that we're going to see, because of those mega trends and the points that I just made, actually, we're going to see a significant amount of innovation coming bottom up from the, I guess we call it the customer, but I mean the folks that pay the bills up by necessity, right? And by the fact actually that to actually have those big projects, actually it will mean actually the energy will change, right, going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Fernando. You raised a lot of interesting points, and I know you probably had more to say, but remember, for all the panelists, we will have the chance in discussions as well, but I'm really looking forward to the discussion of integrating energy into municipal planning. Now I'm going to turn it to Richard Laszlo from Quest, and I'm sure you'll have something to add on that
Sure.
topic as well.
Yeah. Thank you very much to the organizers, Richard and Paul, and everybody here. So Quest, for those of you who don't know Quest, so we're a national nonprofit, and we really focus on, well, a lot of the issues that have been already identified this morning. So the quickest I can sum it up is a community lens on energy issues. And a lot of our work happens here in Ontario, and if you want to know more about our work in Ontario, Alex Benzie is there. Alex, can you please raise your hand? She's our Ontario Caucus Coordinator. And I want to touch on a few points. Fernando, that was great kind of segue for me to go into some of the work that we've been doing on regional planning. We've been doing a lot of work on community energy planning. So those are typically municipally led plans that identify and address energy issues within a community. And regional planning, when it was introduced, I guess a few years ago now, a lot of the communities that we work with across Ontario want to engage and see this as an opportunity to drive forward with the opportunities they've identified in their local communities. The work that we've been doing, we refer to as planning alignment. So as much as we're interested in the regional planning process and what the IESO is doing, we're really interested from a community perspective. So what are the opportunities to align what's happening in the community, these municipally driven plans, with the LDC planning efforts, with gas utility planning efforts, with the IESO regional plans, and even the bulk kind of transmission system. So these plans are happening at different scales, and there's a tremendous opportunity for more alignment, as Joe referenced in his opening remarks. And that's really my kind of opening position really is that the opportunities for better alignment are there. We've identified 6 of them, and I'll go through them in just a second. I should say, though, that this work, full disclosure, that we've done is funded by the IESO. I should also say that we've been successful in securing a third round of funding for this work. So I don't know, maybe I should be careful about what I say before we sign the contract. But in terms of the work that we've done, is really focused on bringing together municipalities, the local distribution companies, and the IESO together, and to have really a closed-door, in-depth discussions around the specific issues. And we focused on GTA North, specifically the York sub-region, as a case study. So that's a jurisdiction we've really focused on. So bringing together Newmarket, Vaughan, Markham, Power Stream, Newmarket Tay, and the IESO together to talk about what the issues are. And I'd say that it was kind of surprising. I mean, our idea was just let's have one meeting and let's see kind of what happens. And it was probably the most productive 3 hours I've ever spent in a meeting with 20 or so people. It was just kind of continual aha moments the entire meeting. Oh, you guys are working on that? Oh, we're doing that. Oh, what? Like, it was just like they didn't know that the other organization was working on specific issues. And so, in terms of those specific opportunities for improved planning alignment, I'm gonna identify the 6 that we did focus on. So the first one is around data sharing and what we called assumption consistency. And Joe mentioned that in terms of kind of the IESO perspective, you've got the IESO working with the LDCs on regional planning. I think municipalities need to be much better integrated into that process. And in fact, the base data around which the regional planning it all comes from municipalities. So the way this all works, the municipalities put together the population assumptions, their growth estimates for economic growth. They hand that to the LDC. The LDC develops their growth assumptions or growth estimates. That feeds up and it gets aggregated to the IESO. So this is all starting with the municipality, but speaking to municipalities across the province, a lot of them feel like they haven't been adequately engaged, that they're not really part of the process. So there's a lot of opportunities around, what are the assumptions that are being used to, for that baseline, developing those forecasts. There's a rich area that can be mined there for further, alignment opportunities. The second one, and this is a big bugbear for me and those of you who've been stuck for any length of time in a room with me, is we need to focus on peak demand. I mean, this one is no-brainer. It's the most expensive energy, or most expensive electricity. Excuse me, Fernando. It's the most polluting, and this kind of top-down regional planning approach is supposed to get at peak demand. Unfortunately, though, when we look at things like conservation demand management incentives, they're just looking at kilowatt hours. There's no real consideration like there was in the previous conservation framework for peak. And so municipalities are getting conservation dollars to do street lighting retrofits exactly at the time when that does nothing for the grid, nothing for the system. So our ratepayer dollars are going to essentially exacerbate a problem around surplus baseload. And I'm not against the idea of street lighting retrofits, but stop using ratepayer dollars to fund this. This is a policy objective that you want to advance. You want to help municipalities achieve their economic objectives. Do that with the public purse, not with ratepayer dollars. Third one is around strong opportunities for further collaboration on energy mapping and spatial targeting of programs. And this is kind of related to my last point, but time of day is important, but geographically that's just as important. So let's start prioritizing where we actually invest these scarce ratepayer dollars. The fourth one is around convergence around provincial objectives, and specifically around greenhouse gases. And this is another one that's near and dear to my heart. I do a lot of work on combined heat and power. And, our work on combined heat and power shows that, at best, we're talking about a reduction in GHGs. At worst, it's probably about a wash. But it's really hard to move and get a clear and concise analysis because we don't know, at what time of day, what the real greenhouse gas value per kilowatt hour is. Using a grid average emission factor, that doesn't cut it. If you're applying a price on carbon, I'm all for it, but let's have an accurate market signal that's actually helping drive the market the way we want. The fifth one is around alignment of incentives and financial mechanisms, and municipalities have tremendous tools to complement conservation programs, to complement programs. This is another rich area. And then the last one is around enhanced engagement. And, I think the LAC meetings, those are public. Those are very important for engaging community members. But a lot of the hard work has to go in advance of those LAC meetings. I think you need to get the municipalities in a room with the LDCs, with the gas utilities, and really start driving towards some of these issues so that the LAC meetings are actually, positive affairs, right? Where we're making decisions and it's not, oh, well, we don't have the information we need, or, this isn't kind of getting to where we want as a community. So those are our opportunities. I'm thrilled that we're funded for this next round of work on planning alignment, and we can build on some of this, bring in the gas utilities, and work with some of the communities that are advancing their energy planning objectives. So thank you.
Thank you, Richard, and thanks for the segue as well, because our next speaker is Sarah van der Paelt from Union Gas. There's been some discussion of broadening the idea of energy to also include gas and not just electricity, so I'm sure that Sarah will have something to add to that. Sarah.
Thank you, George. So my name's Sarah van der Paelt. I'm with Union Gas. For those of you who are aware, we're now part of the Enbridge family. So I'm going to speak a bit on behalf of both, because it's really about the use of gas in the province of Ontario and how we can combine the regional planning of electricity and gas together to optimize the resources that we have already in existence in this province. So building on a couple of comments from the panelists already, there was a comment that we get energy policy, and that planning is really about taking that policy and adding rationality and focus. And that's really what we're talking about here from a regional planning, is how do you take those policies and add a layer of rationality and focus to that. And I look at what some of the things that were shared in terms of how the planning happens at IESO, and the parallels between the planning process in the gas companies are quite considerable. There are some differences. So, for example, we also plan on an annual basis how our systems are going to be used. We have to consider the growth that is going on in our system, where it is being located, and what is driving the growth. We also have to consider reliability, the impacts of weather and system constraints. Along with that, we also have to consider government policies and now the environmental lower carbon issues that have come up. So it's a very systematic approach. We look at all of our different districts. We look at what the facilities are in existence there, the life of them, and what we think we can do to use them and optimize them in the best way. However, where we're different is that we're actually investor-owned companies. We have shareholders, and it is not a government-driven initiative that drives us to design and plan our facilities. It's driven about using your facilities in an optimal manner, in a reliable manner, to meet the needs of your customers. Because we are also not only doing the planning, we are a customer-facing organization. So between Enbridge and ourselves, we send out bills to 3.4 million businesses and households every month. We touch our customers. We know what they use. We've been in business 100 years, and we track the profiles. So that's what helps us with our planning. In addition to that, on the industrial customers and the large commercial, we talk to them, we write their contracts, we ask them about their usage profiles. And that's actually become a very interesting piece in this last year as we try to understand the impacts of a lower carbon future on our large industrial processes and the impacts that that could have on the throughput of natural gas into Ontario. So the other So these plans are similar. We have our facilities business plans. We formerly had a 3-year outlook. The Ontario Energy Board has requested that the utilities provide an asset management plan, which will talk not only about where growth is on our system, but also about integrity, issues in terms of making sure your pipeline is sort of passing all the requirements to be safe and reliable. That will be a 10-year plan, and both Enbridge and Union Gas will be filing those plans later this year. So those will be on file and will be of public record. So interesting, the parallels that we're doing very similar processes, but we're actually doing them in isolation of the electric side. So there was a comment from Richard that on the electric side, the LDCs gather the data and hand that over to the planning groups. So they're gathering all this data, but they're actually not handing it to us, and we're in sort of 400 or 500 of those communities. We're creating that data ourselves, so there might be an opportunity there to start seeing some alignment, and are we all looking at the same pieces? So when you look at those similarities and differences on a regional planning basis, I also want to share that on an operational basis, we actually do have a lot of integration. So from an operational planning perspective, and what I'm talking about now is managing construction, managing outages, system requirements, the electric and the gas businesses are quite linked. So our gas control group works very closely with IESO on planning outages. When we're doing construction, we work with the local LDCs to understand, and the municipalities, what they are planning so that we can optimize where we're creating issues for people in the area, for the public, right, by tearing up a road or going down a side of a road so that we optimize the construction schedules. If somebody's going to have an outage and there's going to need to be a supply change, we work with the companies and coordinate that in order to optimize the systems. So it's done at an operational level. And the question is, how do we now do this at a go-forward planning level? And so that leads you to the question, so why really are we having to do this regional planning? Why has it become so important and really top of mind? And I think it really comes down to today's environment and the economy, and the fact that consumers expect us to use our resources efficiently and to make sure they're used and useful. The idea of having stranded resources, either on the gas side or the electricity side, is unacceptable for either side of that equation. Customers expect us to consider the environment, but they also expect their energy to be affordable. And those two go hand in hand. And with that affordability, the municipalities are expecting that they will get economic development, which will be a growth driver in the province going forward. So I'm really interested in how we go forward with this and making it operational, and how do we get this regional planning, because as I had the best advertisement ever, gas is 75% of the energy mix in the province. We heat your homes, we heat the water, and we run the industrial businesses, and we're not going away. So how do we make this a low carbon using renewable natural gas? How do we make it more efficient? And how do we integrate the resources so that our consumers are getting an affordable and efficient use of the assets that they've already paid for?
Thank you, Sarah. You raised some really interesting challenges to the planning paradigm that we've been discussing. I look forward to exploring that in the question session. And our last speaker is Scott Stevens, a lot of experience in the power sector, particularly at Northland Power. But Scott.
Good morning, everybody. Pleased to be here at Mowat's Emerging Energy Trends Conference. And I've been asked by Paul and Richard to provide the perspective of the IPP, Independent Power Producers perspective. And in fact, it was mentioned the private sector IPP's perspective. So I hope to do that perspective on regional planning. Just an update for you on Northland Power. You no doubt know us or know of us, but we're a mid-cap, mid-sized IPP headquartered here in Ontario. We're rather a product of Ontario energy policy, having started in Northern Ontario, and all of our original assets are operating here in Ontario. We now have about 2,000 megawatts of asset under operation and ownership. Our markets are Ontario and Canada, Europe, parts of Asia and South America, and Mexico. And our fuels are, we call it clean and green. We have onshore and offshore wind power, solar power, biomass, and various forms of natural gas thermal power. Let me start by describing how our project development activities have or have not been impacted by regional planning, and how we see maybe an IPP may be affected differently by regional planning in the future. We have operating assets in Kirkland Lake, Iroquois Falls, and Cochrane, which is now shuttered, and Kingston and in Thorold. Those are thermal assets. We've got wind assets in Manitoulin Island and Grand Bend, and 13 10-megawatt wind farms across Eastern Ontario, Central Ontario, and Northern Ontario. All of those projects were a product of energy procurement programs that predated the regional planning process, so weren't impacted by it. However, more recently and more on topic, some of the development level and development stage projects we're working on now have been impacted by, and as a result of that, we are participating in regional planning. The Dryden, west of Dryden Plan, north of Dryden Plan, Thunder Bay, Marathon, Greenstone Regional Plan, and work on some of the thermal we're doing in the City of Toronto have been impacted by, and we participated by regional planning as a result. But regardless of the planning process that we went through, the process of obtaining municipal approval and going through Planning Act approval and getting public and municipal resident approval has always been central to a developer's list of tasks, maybe the most difficult. And so we're very excited about regional planning's ability to make that run more smoothly. And also, maybe my perspective will be a little bit higher level. I participated in APRO's review of the OPO and LTEP 2016, and some of the comments that APRO made are relevant to regional planning, but I think it's important to have that higher level perspective and talk about how that might filter down and be picked up by and responded to by the regional planning process. So here's a few of the points that I'd like to make. Rate impact, I think, should be the first thing that we talk about. It's front of mind of ratepayers and taxpayers in Ontario, and any planning process should have, I think, rate impact on the first line. So when you talk about the coordination of municipal energy planning and the IESO's regional planning, what are the risks that solutions that are required, and legitimately so, by a municipal plan or regional plan, are going to inappropriately impact the province-wide rate, the power rate? After all, power planning is a provincial responsibility, and when you start to look at it on a community-by-community basis, you're going to get very unique and perhaps more costly solutions, and how we distribute the cost of those solutions across all ratepayers should be something that is attended to. The electricity Ontario sector in Ontario has lacked a central regulator, and I don't see anything in regional planning having changed this. George Vegh's very good article called "Ending the Cycle of Electricity Price Intervention in Ontario" is germane to this point, and what we need are improvements in electricity planning and electricity operational governance in Ontario, and that should be reflected somehow in regional planning as well. I think specifically, and APRO commented on this in its review of the OPO and LTEP, let's have a proper amount of rigor involved in the economic and cost analysis of the various solutions done at the regional planning level, so that that level of rigor is well defined, is transparent, and is something that is similar to the kinds of rigor that other utility and energy markets, let's say in the U.S., something like PJM or IESO. They can't be the same processes, of course, but the degree of rigor, I think, should be at that level. One of the functions of regional planning via the LDCs is to conduct load growth forecast projection and identify a complete inventory of all potential generation, DSM, storage, and transmission and distribution system requirements. Some of my experience in participating in regional planning would have me believe that that gets done, and in other cases, I'm not so sure. In the case of Northwestern Ontario regional plans, what the IESO did that I liked was they ran a process to look at, to ensure that they got all of different proposals from generators and demand management. It was a call for tender for just expressions of interest. And that ensured that not only did all of the potential suppliers of solutions, both generation and demand management and wires, get an opportunity to put forward what they thought were potential solutions, but it allowed the IESO to see an inventory of all of the possibilities. I didn't see that done in Toronto. It was a different process, so there was no doubt a reason for it. But I think that ensuring that you capture what all your options are is central importance. The main designers of LTEP and regional planning is the IESO, Hydro One, and the LDCs, all of which are transmission and distribution entities. So not surprising, the plans have been heavily weighted towards T&D solutions. Perhaps it's up to the private sector and suppliers of generation, demand management, and storage technologies to participate more in the process to ensure that all solutions are identified. So looking forward, the future of electricity rate pressures looks even riskier than it has in the past. APRO's submission to the IESO and OPO LTEP 2016 were unanimous in identifying that the medium and long-term supply-demand outlook in Ontario is characterized by across-the-board risks. There's a heavily reliance on DSM, and we're not sure that that is being thoroughly and adequately priced. Is there an adequate argument for DSM off-peak if we're in a market that is characterized by overcapacity? There's huge amount of risk resulting from the fact that we've got Pickering, Darlington, and Bruce issues and huge amounts of nuclear energy and the cost associated with dealing with those extensions and refurbishments. So all of this risk, one more risk, and then I'll kind of round the discussion out to show you how this all comes together. I can assure you it does. The question about what the cost of all of this embedded generation and self-generation leaving the system. So how do we forecast load growth if we've got an unknown amount of distributed generation and DER resources leaving the system and no longer contributing to legacy costs? It was interesting, I was talking to somebody at the beginning of the session, and they mentioned that, or maybe it was mentioned up here, that California has come up with a way to charge legacy costs to those exiting the system, something that we want to pay attention to here. And then two more points. One is Ontario's climate change action plan. Huge risks and cost involved with the electrification of gas loads. What's the quantum of that? What's the cost of that? How do the cost of those get distributed to the program that's resulting from those costs, i.e. carbon reduction costs? Does that get allocated to carbon tax revenue adequately? And then all of this risk means that we should ensure that regional planning includes contingency planning. Let's ensure that if the initial plans and the initial solutions turn out to be either more expensive or not appropriate, that we have contingency planning so that we've got a plan B if plan A doesn't turn out to be appropriate. And then to leave this on what sounds like a positive note, I know I sound like a bit of a bear up here, but the fact that we're driven by technology development, we don't know the direction it's taking, but we do know that there's going to be less and less central power and more distributed power. I think the very exciting benefit of distributed generation is that we may be eventually in an area where we're not spending a lot of money on central wires. So maybe for those reasons, at a certain point of electricity, the cost of power may go down because that's a cost that we don't have to bear. So I'll end my comments there, and I look forward to the next part of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. A lot of interesting points and points for discussion. So the panel, that comes to the end of the panel formal presentation. We are looking forward to questions from the audience, and I would also encourage the panel members to ask questions pointed at each other, because you're very well informed on these issues, and that could lead to a very stimulating conversation. I want to start with one question, and then I'd look for the audience or panel members to chime in with their own. And I want to just address this at a very high level. You're all very engaged in and involved in planning issues, and all of the planning that we're doing in this province sometimes leaves me a bit baffled as to how it's all supposed to work. So when we consider the different planning exercises that we have going on, and you look at planning broadly, it's how do we acquire resources or manage resources. We have the regional planning that we've heard a lot of discussion about. We have distribution system plans at the electricity level, also at the gas level as well. The system planning, we have the long-term energy plan, which some people referred to. And we also have the climate change action plan, which has a massive impact on electricity infrastructure. And then we have the IESO is also pursuing market renewal, which is a market-based approach to determining what resources we should require and when. So we have all these different planning exercises going on. And then we have the government just kind of deciding things on, sometimes out of the blue, on what it's going to do, a capacity contract with Quebec, or freezing prices or cutting prices for consumers, which obviously has an impact on planning assumptions around price. So what would be, I'd like to have some comments on, perhaps Joe, I could put you on the spot because you're a friend. Who's the decision maker? We have all this planning going on and a lot of wheels turning. But once we have these plans, who decides on kind of the implementation of which plan?
Well, George, it's all perfectly coordinated. Come on. So who's the decision maker? Is that it came down to? So I think the answer to that, unfortunately, is it depends, right? With respect to energy planning in the province, overall, at the provincial level, I would say the decision maker there with respect to policy is the Government of Ontario through the creation of the long-term energy plan. We've all just gone through a significant sort of engagement effort that's happened across the province with respect to the long-term energy plan. And the government takes input from many sources when they develop that plan. And that, with respect to the IESO and electricity planning, that is a governing document that we respond to. As part of this next long-term energy plan that comes out, we're required to produce an implementation plan for the long-term energy plan with respect to electricity only. So I would say the decision maker at the provincial energy planning level is the province. Now, when you get into electricity planning, I would say there are various decision makers depending on the nature of the investment. If you look at decision making with respect to bulk transmission plan, there again the IESO would make the recommendation of the need to reinforce the bulk transmission system. Let's say to either enable more trade with another jurisdiction, or to relieve congestion on the bulk transmission system and free up more competition, let's say, for other generators to play in a market. When it comes to a regional area, I would say there is joint decision-making with respect to what's needed in that area, and I think that's a very healthy discussion. All people involved in regional planning have with respect to what's the best solution for a specific area. We have all three parties at the table. We have the IESO, we have the transmitter that's serving the local area, and we have the local distribution company or local distribution companies, depending on the size of the area, all basically attempting to reach a consensus on what the best thing to do is to meet that local area. And there I would say the decision maker or the decision makers are those three entities that try to reach a consensus on what the best thing to do is in the near term. I think I'll leave it there for now.
All right, thanks, Joe. Any other comments on all the planning that's going on and the decision-making process as a part of that? Sarah, did you want to add something?
I would just like to add on a couple of your comments, mainly at the regional level. So one of the things we've seen with the policies is that you have to really consider the regions. Some of the policies and the plans that you've mentioned have a very, we'll call it GTA, urban-centric approach, which doesn't fit for a vast part of Ontario. From a population basis, it does, but you think about taking some of those plans and trying to put electrification of some of those items in a Thunder Bay, a Sudbury, Windsor, they're very difficult. And that's where the regional planning becomes very important. And I think the collaboration of the various parties at the regional level is critical, but I'm sort of disciplined from the approach that you can only have one decision maker. In the end, when you don't reach collaboration, who has decision-making rights on what happens in that region? And I think it has to be the municipality, it has to be the region. It always comes back to who lives with the consequences of those decisions. So when they don't have the energy that they need, there's brownouts, there's no gas, the reliability's gone down because of decisions. It's the municipal authorities, the municipal government who's usually contacted. If they can't get the service they require, who's contacted? It's municipality. If they can't attract business because they don't have the energy requirements they need, it's the municipality. So I think when you get to the regional level, I believe that it's the municipality that has to have the ultimate decision-making right on what goes in or does not go in into their area.
That's an interesting perspective. I want to pick up on that a bit. Does anyone else on the panel want to offer a view on that?
I'll say, Sarah, I agree with you as far as it goes, but given that electricity planning and operating the electricity system in Ontario is a provincial responsibility, I think we can't just leave it there at that. I think that's the direction that we should take. But and the fact that we need to be regulated at a provincial level, but yet decision-making should be made at a regional level, leaves us with this question about, where do we go from here in order to ensure that the system works at the broadest provincial level. But I agree, because electricity is getting to be such a complicated matter technically that municipal decision-making is probably the direction it should take.
Thanks. If I could, Fernando, just pick up on a point you made in your discussion. I think it's integrated. So you were talking about the need to integrate energy planning, both gas and electricity, into municipal planning. And one thing I often wonder, and I appreciate kind of an outsider perspective of someone who's not kind of in the weeds, as we all are in this sector. Do you think we overly complicate energy planning with all these agencies and institutions and formulas, and because if the question is, is it really as special as we think it is, or is it just an input, in the way that transportation needs are an input and garbage collection is an input? Is this just an input into basic services, and we should just be looking at electricity as infrastructure as opposed to this unique exercise that requires expert bodies and all this different work? What's your take on this?
I don't know, that's a great question, actually. I'm not sure if I'm qualified to answer all of that, but I'll give you actually some a sense actually of what I see, trying to do work at the sort of at the minimum expression, right? What I see actually is what we're trying to do, and by the way, actually, I'd like to report that we've almost come to the end of integrating energy actually at the City of Toronto into the municipal processes. And what I see actually is that I'm not sure if you can integrate all of this, at the provincial level, to be honest. Like, I don't see how, because we don't do it in any other area, right, to your point? Yeah. So what I see actually is, the baton passing provincial and municipal relations, right? around transportation, around even health in terms of public health, social housing, but of course actually more prominently on land use where there's a delegated authority, right? And also on building codes, right? So we have right now community energy plans for the city of Toronto at the city scale that they're 10 years old, so predates actually regional planning. We have actually community energy plans at the smaller area to look at growth. So the one that we're doing right now, which may answer your question in a sense, actually is the largest community energy plan that we'll ever do, which is the downtown Toronto, where we are right now. And that plan actually is essentially looking at, look, if we're going to get all this growth, you need actually to have infrastructure. And don't stop at hard infrastructure. It's also soft infrastructure, right? So these are, in a sense, actually the way it feels, at the municipal level, actually, these are actually conversations that the province starts, always, right? Don't forget that municipalities are a franchise of the provincial government, right? That's all we are, right? It's just a way to actually take the orders in, right? No different than Pizza or Tim Hortons, right? There's an integration. It's an integration actually of economies of scope around a certain geography, and then we do all that large scope and then bundle it for the province, right? The province actually would be challenged to actually run everything from Queen's Park, but they are on the electricity file, right? I think primarily because they're conflicted, right? They own it, they're regulated, they take political flack for it, right? It's really, really difficult, right? Yeah. And I'm not saying I don't have a solution, right? But just observations around, leading essentially an innovation team, a startup, within the city, trying to do just what you described, and having actually basically come to the end of the line in terms of, the powers that we have. I can tell you actually that it was difficult enough, doing it actually at a municipal level, right? Like I don't see how you do it actually at a provincial level. So it may be an opportunity now to look at the other processes, right? That in terms of provincial and municipal relations, right? Mm-hmm. And I realize that because of path dependency and again all the hats that the province wears on the electricity system, which doesn't wear in any other system that I'm aware of, right? That it may be actually sort of a special response to it, but. I think the complication stems from the fact that the reality is changing, right? And the response to that actually is sort of more layers, right? So we'll have to simplify, in one way or another.
Thanks, Richard. Did you have anything you want to? I'm going to ask Richard to comment on this as well, because I know this is one of your ideas on how to integrate planning. In particular, if you could address the question of, is there something really that special about energy versus other types of infrastructure? But I also want to encourage people to, we have microphones if you want to ask your questions, and Paul's just handed me a number of questions as well. So, Richard, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question. I mean, ultimately, I don't think electricity is special. Sorry. I think, this province, we used to own and regulate airlines, oil production, gas production. And on the basis that the rationale was that, there wouldn't be, the markets wouldn't kind of do it on their own. I mean, doesn't that seem so ridiculous now? And so I think all this is really a big process of the province kind of letting go. And it's going to take a while. But, I mean, you mentioned the IESO, you mentioned the LDCs, you mentioned Hydro One. I've been in this very room many times with Ron and his team talking about innovation and how, these three organizations struggle with innovation. That's not where the innovation is coming from. That's not where the new technologies are coming from. So if then we're hearing that the bias in these regional planning efforts is on transmission and distribution and wire solutions, well, I mean, obviously. So how do we start getting some of the new technologies in and the innovation and the new ideas? It's by, we got to expand the problem and start bringing in the municipalities in, bring the gas utilities in, and expand the scope of this regional planning to really get down at some of these creative solutions that we can put forward.
Can I just pick up on a point you made there and ask Joe to comment on it, because you mentioned this as well, this bias towards transmission distribution solutions, and you said this is one of the lessons learned from the first round. And maybe we just, whoever's interested in commenting on this as well, just take a couple of minutes to explain what do you think is the source of that bias? Is it the fact that these are regulated companies and therefore there's a regulator who can just tell them to go ahead and they get recovery and rate base, whereas distributed energy doesn't have a rate-regulated utility behind it. It's more spontaneous activity, so the constituency isn't there at every meeting in the way that utilities could be there. Or, like, what is it that kind of leads to this bias, and what could you do to overcome this bias?
Okay, so I personally don't think it's a bias, so I didn't use that word, you did.
No, it's
so,
not.
Yeah, that was me. That was me.
So what I said was the first time through the province, there was a significant amount of catch-up to do. We did find growth areas or areas that were, I would say, somewhat deficient in reliability, and we made some corrective action. And the way to do that the first time through the province was to look at some near-term solutions. And what we did, even that first time through the province, we did look at alternatives to wire solutions, more conservation, targeted conservation, demand-side response, and even looking at small-scale generation and distributed energy resources. What we found was, because there is an abundance of both, in fact, the first time through the province, there was an abundance of both generation capacity at the system level and energy. And as a result, it was more cost-effective to deliver that energy over wires because it was available. So putting in more energy resources was not cost-effective, or even in some cases doing more conservation was not determined to be cost-effective, because we did do a cost-effectiveness test. So I don't think there was a bias. Certainly going forward, I know that the people in planning, and we work closely with the conservation groups, both within the IESO and within the local distribution companies. There is, in fact, a lot of interest in looking at these alternative types of solutions. And what we're doing is looking for the business case. Just where is that opportunity? Many LDCs, since they have the closest relationship to the customers, are getting into that line of business, as not as a regulated business, but as a competitive side of their business. And they're looking into getting into that type of relationship with their customers. And that could make things turn the corner, especially as the cost of technology goes down.
Thanks, Joe. Anyone on the panel like to comment on that diagnosis of whether or not there is a bias, or that was just the first round? Any comments on that, or to go on? I have a good question from the audience.
I'm the one who said it, so yeah. And I wasn't. It may be biased. I don't think I was. It's not necessarily like I'm not being pejorative about saying that they have a bias, that it's bad. I think it's like that's what they know, right. So that's what they do. That's natural. We all do that. I think that the situation you describe, where now we're looking to make significant long-term investments in nuclear power that are going to lock our province in and essentially shut out a lot of these potential solutions that are coming to the fore now. That's what kind of has me, I fear for the future as a result. And so, this whole regional planning exercise is essentially we're constraining the options by doubling down on the centralized system right at the moment where the rest of the world has woken up to these solutions. And it's not just Ontario. BC's making the same mistake with Site C. Do you really think California is going to buy their power in 30 years? So significant public dollars instead of private investments. That's an issue. So I kind of see it that way. It's if you're looking at the transmission and distribution, and that's a cycle, where you're then encouraged to invest in that centralized generation, which then perpetuates itself.
Sarah, did you want to add something?
So just what we're seeing on the sort of build out of the gas system. So there was the issue about cost effectiveness. So where there is constraints in the system, so where there's excess capacity, obviously you go with the most cost effective solution, and that is to use your traditional assets. And it's what people are familiar with. So, you know, when a call comes in, the first call is I'd like to have pipe, right? I'd like to have pipe to my site. But then the cost effectiveness test comes in, and when people realize so what the cost is when you're getting into big facilities, that becomes a reality. And that's when we're seeing people start to look at innovative solutions to say that, you know, I need natural gas as an energy source, but that cost is more than I can absorb as an entity, you know, in order to further my economic development. So they really do play a hand in hand, but I think it starts to show up more when you start to hit constraints or when you start to see areas where it's either cost constraint or facilities constraint. So we are starting to see, we do have one up in operation, but we're starting to see people who are actually doing the virtual pipeline, where it is cheaper for them to transport compressed natural gas, or they're looking at liquefied natural gas, than actually building a traditional pipeline in areas where there is no pipe. And so these are large industrials where they're paying their own freight, but that's, I think, where you get your innovation, where you start to have those constrained areas, and the cost of the traditional assets and putting that infrastructure is on both electricity and gas is getting quite exorbitant.
It's interesting. That relates to some of the questions that have come in from the audience, some very good questions, and I want to see if I can put a few of them together, because something you raised in your comments, Sarah, and Scott, you kind of raised this as well. There were some questions about potentially stranding costs. And, you know, one of the interesting elements in this province is that after with the decision to shut down coal, the province went heavy into gas, heavy commitment to natural gas generators, and believing, you know, gas was the solution. And now you almost get a sense of a buyer's remorse from the province that they have all these new gas assets and they wish they didn't have to use them. And so you see policies being developed to reduce the use of natural gas, obviously, because of the greenhouse gases. And so, given that context, how should either planning or gas generators or gas distributors see the role of, you know, making use of assets, not having stranded assets, or should that be a factor at all? Should someone just say, well, we're moving on, we made a big bet on fossil fuels, and now we're going in another direction? How do we deal with the potentially stranded asset issue? Maybe you could both address it.
Well, the one point that I'd make is economics are economics, and if money was spent and today the economics of running that asset aren't there, the asset shouldn't be run. So I think that's the first thing. But, you know, is that the case? Is there peak reduction, or are there other things being done? I mean, there's a cost now for carbon, so the economics of running gas plants are different than they were when they were first designed. But I think you have to do the most economic thing as economics change, and if that means that we've got idled gas assets, then so be it.
So I'd say it's led to some innovation on our side. So with the introduction of cap and trade, we are well aware of sort of the assets we have in the ground. Anytime we've built out transmission assets or distribution assets, we always look to see that there is market demand in that area that is sustainable and long-term. Because very conscious, both from a ratepayer and a shareholder perspective, that you don't want to build assets that aren't going to be used and useful. So recent things that we've tried, for example, on the distribution side, is for the first time we actually went to end-use customers, large end-use customers, before building out a transmission system, and they were power customers as well as some industrials, to say, do you think you're going to need your contracts? Your contracts, you know, do you want to turn them back? So that's almost unheard of a distribution utility saying, would you like to get out of your contract before we build these assets? Because if you don't need that asset any longer, then we don't need to build. So trying to do those sorts of things proactively. We're also looking for other markets, so very conscious that rates are really a function of how much gas goes through your system. So throughput is a big function of that. What are the other markets where gas is the lower carbon alternative? So if you look at the heavy-duty transportation market, that is definitely where there are greenhouse gas savings, very aligned with provincial objectives, a good amount of throughput. Think about the marine sector, right? You can actually start to use your assets in a similar way, but for different markets, or perhaps repurpose them all together by looking at things like renewable natural gas, or looking at hydrogen and storing hydrogen into the system. So it's encouraging innovation in both Enbridge and Union Gas to find new ways of using our assets going forward and finding those markets where we're the lower carbon alternative.
Maybe I'll pick up on that theme as we go to another set of questions from the audience. And again, I'll add my own spin to it. I asked a question before about who the final decision maker was or should be. And of course, being Ontario, we all started to think about which government agency ought to be making this decision. And the question from the audience was, well, the final decision maker should be the consumer. And so that's an interesting approach. So then my question would be to have you comment on how do you bring the customer in? There's a lot of talk about customer engagement, and also the technology is empowering customers, and we always hear a lot of that. But we do have a heavily regulated sector, and so customers, when they come in, it's somewhat notionally, like in a OEB process or in any other process where someone is asked to represent the interests of consumers. But the question is, like, can you have a market signal? Can you have a more of a systematic ability for consumers to respond and make their choices, as opposed to just having kind of a contrived customer choice landed on by a regulator? Some people are nodding, some people are shaking their heads. Why don't we all maybe go down the row, start with Scott, and whoever wants to comment on it can comment on that.
Okay. Well, one comment is that maybe, again, it's technology development, and maybe you rely on new suppliers of new technology that are customer-focused. I was having a comment earlier this morning about Nest having this new technology that they're aggregating customers, and you install one of these things and it automatically turns your air conditioning off during the peak hours. So you're involving a customer there by having a product and a company that goes directly to the customer, and they're making wise energy choices because that new technology is now available to them. So maybe just one example.
Thanks, Scott.
I think cost is really, when it comes to electricity, I really think it's the only, or energy, I really think it's the only kind of point of leverage. People talk about value, but when I look at the other types of technologies that are coming, people compare it with, Netflix or smartphone or Uber. There's a fundamental difference. Those are providing a different value proposition, and it's significant. And people are people are willing to pay more for that, but with energy, I just don't see it. People talk about Internet of Things, and I don't know, maybe I'm a Luddite here, but my mom's fancy digital fridge, it can't even produce the ice cubes. So I wonder how, is this really going to work? I'm skeptical. So I think cost really is the only way to really engage customers.
Thanks. But maybe before I want to interrupt Richard with put him on the spot again. So this legislation's in front of the legislature right now that's going to reduce electricity prices for residential customers by 17 or 25%. So when you say cost is the real driver, and cost will drive behavior, and then the government is reducing costs, do you have I don't know where to go with that, other than, does that leave you totally pessimistic? Your one view of where you could have some. Yeah,
people are hurting, families are hurting. So, and it's a serious issue. Affordability is a very serious issue, and it's not to be taken lightly. And when I look at some back of the envelope calculations I've made around switching from, if you switch from a natural gas furnace and you move to electric baseboard heating, does anyone want to take a wild guess at what your cost of abatement is on an operating cost only?
Sure, Sarah could.
Why would you do that?
I'm sorry?
Why would you do that?
Well, that's the signal that's going out to to customers. I mean, that's like the action plan that's going out there, this idea that we've got to roll up the natural gas grid. I mean, we're talking about operating, I mean, your marginal cost of abatement for a ton of reduction is something like $1,200, north of $1,200 per ton. You know, yeah, you put heat pumps, it comes down, but then you've got, you know, capital and, you know, all kinds of stuff that you're doing. So, I mean, it's, I don't know, I look at this recent Fair Hydro plan, and, you know, I mean, I don't know if you've seen the budget, I forget the name of the accountability, the budget officer's report. I mean, I opened it up, I read the first bullet, and I closed it down. And the first bullet is, I mean, we're spending $45 billion for you know, $21 billion. So that's essentially a gas plant scandal every year for the next 20 years.
We don't want that.
So sorry, Sarah, I interrupted. You were going to.
So really great point. So cost, so I would actually argue that the consumers actually are the decision makers today, right? They'll turn their thermostat on, they'll make choices, they'll put in solar panels, they'll use less electricity. I think where we have the disconnect is the affordability. There's some that those choices are a necessity, and they're not choices any of us would want to make, to be honest. But the other piece that we see with customer behavior is reliability. So you don't ever get more customer calls at your call center than the day that you don't have power, or you don't have energy, or you don't have heat. And that's all of a sudden where, because as a friend of mine said this weekend, it's the problems of a first world country, right? Energy is so much taken for granted, whether it be electricity or heat or any of those supplies, that we argue about the price, but we don't think about what happens if we don't have it, until we don't have it. And that's when we start to want to consider maybe paying a different price or doing something differently. So I think that would be the other factor that comes into play. Your other question was around customer consultation. So in fact, the Ontario Energy Board has tried to put in a customer consultation process for the next round of our rate case hearings, where we did sort of online surveys and things like that. And it was really around the rates and what should you put in your rates. The challenge we really found was, although do we think we're more complicated than we are? Trying to explain the business in terms for someone where the bill is less than their cell phone bill, they're like, okay, I turn my like, what do you want me to ask, right? So that's really the challenge, is we try to do consultation. We have to do a big education piece first in order to get answers back that make sense. And we're working on that, but that is definitely a challenge.
Thanks, Fernando.
Comment. So I just want to pick up on what Richard was saying. Hopefully we're not down on innovation, here at Mars, right? Yeah, that would be quite tragic. So if you don't like innovation, typically actually what we don't like is reality, right? Reality is uncomfortable. It's telling you things that, we rather actually not acknowledge, right? And then we make two mistakes actually when there's a disruption or innovation, typically, right? First of all, we overestimate, the ramp up, right? So we go to, no gas, 100% electricity, right? That's foolish, right? And then because we didn't get that huge ramp up that we expected, we sort of leave it alone and forget about it. And then it catches us by surprise again when it really ramps up, right? So what I'm looking at actually, being sort of in the frontier, in the trenches actually of this discussion, right? Is that the best business case really is around growth, new opportunities, right? So if we have, if we have billions of dollars of development, we have about $40 billion of development coming in Toronto. Like these are applications on hand. Energy is a pittance, okay? However you define it, actually, it's like 3 to 4% at most, right? So clearly, actually, you're not going to have, a current paradigm, ransom, the big project, right? So things are going to happen, and politics is going to be part of it, right? The Metrolinx Eglinton Crosstown was supposed to have an 18 megawatt gas plant, right? Guess what? It's going to get a 20 megawatt actually lithium-ion battery with solar panels and so on, because the community didn't like it. Politics came in, and politics is messy, by the way, right? As we all know, it's a bit of a blunt tool. So what's going to happen actually is that the best business case will be around new growth, like Sarah was saying. When you have a customer actually, and when you say customer, interesting enough, actually, these are development that doesn't have customers yet. So you'd be surprised to know maybe that you cannot build, you cannot have a new development in Toronto anymore unless you submit an energy and emission strategy as part of your complete application, right? So we're trying to actually nudge the development cycle, the $40 to $50 billion, right? To take in, right? To take in actually the little guy, the 2-3% actually of energy into the scope, right? And they realize, the development community realizes actually that there's not only inherent risk, but they can actually future-proof these developments, going forward, right? So how is it going to turn out? I don't know. But I find it ironic that we're looking for distributed solutions, through a central planning process, right? That doesn't work, right?
Go ahead, Joe, you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, well, I would say definitely the customer perspective and customers making decisions are very important in the overall process. I believe as part of the regional planning process, the engagement effort that we conduct as part of regional planning helps to get a lot of that, I believe. Again, local distribution companies are very well plugged in with their customer base. And in some cases, I know in the Toronto plan, for example, there was actually customer consultation through surveys. As Sarah indicated, though, there was a big ramp up with respect to a need for sort of communication and bringing the customers along, so you get good answers to your survey questions. Also, many of the customers that we deal with in regional planning are large industrials, and in many cases, we have direct discussions in confidence with those customers. Many of them don't want to share their expansion plans, but we do, as IESO, have direct discussions with them and factor their input into regional planning. We also deal with customer representatives like the Ontario Mining Association, AMPCO, and others. And then in the end, I think in many cases, especially with new technologies, I think in those cases, as the cost of technology comes down, the market will help decide.
Go ahead.
No, that was it.
Richard's
That was
fine.
That was my close.
Last word to you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Richard and Paul, for putting together this very interesting panel. I appreciated the insights very much.
And let me reinforce that to George and to the panel, an excellent debate. Just a couple of very quick observations. We are at the corner almost of College and Bay, so that is the center of the known universe, as we all know. And as we discuss regional energy planning in Ontario in 2017, I wonder what this conversation would be like if it were being held in Kenora, Kirkland Lake, Bancroft. There are at least 5 Ontarios, as far as I can tell now. And if you haven't looked at the most recent data from the 2016 Canadian National Census, take a good look and just digest what that data now suggests, that the growth in Ontario and the growth in Canada is really all in 1 or 2 places. One place is growing, that would be the GT and HA, and even within that, the growth is not, but it's very heavily concentrated there, and everybody else is virtually static or declining. So on the question of regional energy planning, if you're looking at the province or the country, I would argue we have entered a very new and dangerous place, because 60% of Canadians are soon about to be living in 3 or 4 cities. And energy and regionalism have a very long and dangerous relationship. I think it's about to get a lot more interesting. So, and Fernando made a very good point about Toronto, especially Toronto south of Eglinton. Somebody here did actually make the point about City Place. All I remember is last summer, I think it was late August, there were 3 or 4 significant power outages at City Place that affected thousands of people for, in one case, I think, very nearly a day. So regional energy planning, what does that mean in a province and country where the table is now so skewed, where the growth is so heavily in one place and every place else is a bystander? And final observation, because I think the panel did a very good job about this, and most of you said it, the consumer obviously has to have a really important role in this, and in the end, many of you feel the consumer needs to make the final decision. Just a cautionary tale. A salesman named Donald J. Trump recently went out to consult with the consumers, and energy was actually part of the dialogue. And in places like Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Pennsylvania, actually, that salesman, having met those consumers, has taken us to a very interesting place. Not one necessarily that suggests that in these matters, rationality is always going to win the first or second inning of a 9-inning ball game. Thank you very much, panel. 15 minutes for a break, and our second panel begins 15 minutes from now on the subject of distributed energy resources.